Hi Ruby, overall your photograms turned out fairly well. I kind of get the impression that you pushed this off towards the end, and we see that even here. They photographed the prints while they were still wet before they dried. That certainly gives yourselves a few more challenges than had you had some more time to practice with this. However, despite that, I think that they turned out fairly well. One of the things that you said you were disappointed with was that the veins of the leaves didn't turn out more, well, didn't turn out more. And part of the reason is just because the leaves that you chose have relatively low opacity. And so the more translucent the leaf that you choose, the more likely you're going to be able to see that veining coming through. Certainly really long exposures can help, and I think that's what we see here. We see very, very dark blue background, and so we're starting just to see the barest hint of veining here in this leaf. So going even longer, we can expect that more of that would start to show through. However, on the flip side, we're also starting to see some blue coming through here, so you kind of balance that with what does come through with what you want to come through. And there's really no appropriate guide for how long you're going to want to do these things. It just takes a little bit of experimental trial and error in order to get the right results. Overall, I think this one here looks very good. I think this one looks pretty good. These ones here, we're starting to lose a little bit of detail, and I think that the biggest issue is these probably had a little bit more of a delicate nature, and so you might want to combine more of the dense leaves with similarly dense leaves, and the more delicate ones with more delicate ones on one photogram. It's going to give you a little bit easier time of it. I actually like this one quite a bit. So you found that these leaves had a little bit of texture, and they weren't sitting quite flat. And you said that you had addressed that by adding in additional paper into the frame, and that's certainly an appropriate way to go. However, we're still seeing a little bit of that three-dimensional nature kind of coming through, in that we have areas that are nice and sharp and crisp, and then areas that are blurred a little bit more. And so what that's telling me is that not all of the leaves were flat on it. However, I think it actually gives it kind of a interesting effect, primarily because the areas that are very firmly against the paper, we see this really nice leaf structure coming through. And so the contrast between this fine detail and the areas that are a little bit more amorphous turns out pretty nice in the print. The other thing we see are these little dots of white, and one of the problems with paper, and even really high-end paper, is that dust from the cutting process will get in there, and when they get kind of smushed together in a pack, then what happens is they get pretty tightly bound and adhered to the paper itself. And so when you're painting something with the cyanotype, then, or even if it's an inkjet, for example, the ink will go, or the cyanotype media will apply to it, but then when you're washing it, which is a relatively rough process, it'll get knocked off. Similarly with the inkjets, once the ink has kind of come through, then it goes through these rollers, and then it'll fall off, and you'll see these white dots. That's what that represents. And so the best way to deal with that is to kind of flex the paper before you start to use it. Brush it off maybe with a kind of an abrasive sort of brush, although depending on the media, if it's an inkjet media, you wouldn't want to be too much of a aggressive brush, because then that would cause troubles of its own. So definitely another trial and error. I like the shapes here. I actually like that we're losing a little bit of the detail here in the stems. Kind of makes for a interesting overall look. Again, I think that this is going to look very different once it's dry compared to when it's wet, and a little bit of extra time there would make a difference. I'm not sure what's going on here, but you're getting these little bit of swirls in the paper. I think that actually adds a little bit of visual interest to the print as well. Finally here with the pine needles, that was always going to be your trickiest one. Not only are the sprigs very, they've got a lot of dimension. So this sprig was probably, I'm going to guess maybe an inch thick to begin with, meaning that only some of the bristles were going to be up against the paper. But they are very, very opaque and almost no light gets through. So we're going to get areas where the needles were against the paper. It's going to turn out as white. Everything else is going to turn out is kind of this is just very, very stereotypical. We see kind of the hint of shape, but we don't actually see the details themselves. A better effort would have probably been had you taken the needles off and made some sort of design of it, or maybe remove all of the needles on the back of the little sprig and just use the ones that are and the front, and just use ones that are kind of coming out of the side, and then you might get the idea of what you're working with without having some of the extra difficulty of working with something that has that real height to it. Overall, I think you're on the right track. I think it just needs a little bit more time, a little bit more practice, and you'll get the hang of the photogram thing down pat. Let me know if you have any questions.